think my experience photographing the protests was a little different from most, at least from a photojournalistic perspective, because I was there to march and I just happened to have a camera with me. So I was just diving headfirst into the learning process of getting to know these really difficult experiences that people were having. And that's one of the sort of subtle differences in what I've brought. There's a touch of sweetness and hopefulness to the perspective that I kind of was able to gain through this experience.
Welcome to Binder. I'm Ray McManus. I can remember, sitting in a classroom, and one of the things that we would do is look at a piece of fiction or look at poems, and we would talk about the themes. What are the themes of this piece? And there were, themes were always, big things, love, war, death. It makes you think that in order to create art, you have to be thinking about those big things. But life doesn't really revolve around big things. We look back at our lives and we can certainly punctuate it by big things. This was the year I graduated. This was the year I got married. This was the month that I wrecked my car. These are big, big moments. But our day-to-day lives are full of so many small moments, and they happen sometimes rather fast. Simply holding a door open for someone when they walk through, how that experience might have changed that person's life. It seems so small and so insignificant, but maybe they had a really bad day, and that was the one moment that turned things around for them because they thought somebody cared enough to hold a door open for them. I think with artists, and especially with Catherine's work, by focusing on the smaller things, the hands, the facial expressions, the way lighting hits in the evening on a group of people, you begin to not see them as subjects for a photograph, but you see them as human beings. And it suddenly becomes more real.
It kind of stemmed from social anxiety in the beginning, especially coming into large group settings, which is how I ended up with my camera at the marches last year. Actually, I was kind of so overwhelmed to be around so many people after having not been around people for so long that my camera was actually sort of just a tool to break the barrier. My name is Catherine Hunsinger. I am a musician and primarily in a few rock bands.
It's hard looking back at the things that I thought.
And I am a photographer in a previous life.
Thought to me under my.
And now I'm just kind of a hobbyist photographer, when the time and moment calls.
With eyes not yet open.
I see everything in collected images and beauty in such small moments, which is why I always use hyper zoom, because I love the little things. A couple of years ago, I went to my first protest and I discovered that there was just so much, I don't want to call it magic because it's such a difficult situation, but there were so many beautiful moments that I couldn't capture, and I was sitting there watching them, how am I going to preserve these moments that are happening or be able to communicate them? So that's where I just started bringing the camera with me.
Right. There's one thing you said, and I think this is sort of indicative, I think, of some of your work that's on display here, is focusing on the smaller aspects or the smaller thing. And I'm thinking particularly the image of the hands. Often when we, especially when we look back to 2020, so many big things happening all at once, right? We've got a global pandemic, right, that's happening. And then we see protests popping up all over the country, that wasn't just from George Floyd. It became a culmination of a lot of things. It was, I think, hard for a lot of America to really kind of wrap their head around the small things. For instance, when you think about with COVID, when you see the numbers or you see footage of a hospital or something, there's distance. But then when a family member or loved one gets it and is in the hospital, suddenly it's close. When you're in that moment, especially when you're capturing images around the protests, there's a lot going on. Are you consciously looking for those places where you can hyper zoom on something?
I think I was looking for moments, but they were also just so, they were bountiful. Especially one of the photos I shared, I think I called it After Sunset. A group of protesters every single night would just stay until 11 o'clock until the curfew for COVID said, get out. And those were just the most incredible moments where people were the most vulnerable that I saw. The stories that were shared were so heartbreaking. And, there's part of you that feels weird putting your camera in somebody's face while they're telling their whole story to you that you can't even begin to relate to. But having created those genuine friendships with the people that I was standing for and standing beside was what made me able to just be there and stay there and feel comfortable taking pictures of their faces. People were being turned in based on their faces being in pictures and media. So part of my process became every time I took a picture of somebody, I would approach them and ask them if I could share their picture, which was also a really interesting and unique way to get to know people at a different level and ask them more questions. Why were they there? What that moment that I showed them meant to them. Most of the moments just created themselves, and sometimes you just look up and there it is, fists in the sunset. You can't ask for that. It just happens.
Right.
Yeah.
I think one of the things that really stands out in your work, and it makes sense to hear you as you describe really what you saw, your role there as being, you're there as a participant. You're there as just a member of the community who happens to have a camera, versus someone maybe going there because they're on an assignment or, they have a different agenda or something like that. Your work, what really stands out to me is how much, you capture really the human element of what's going on at a time when there's too many opportunities to dehumanize and polarize. And when there's images that capture facial expressions where you're able to see, it's not anger, but anguish or a genuine, hope, or even juxtapositions of images of a child in this particular environment. And that's something that I really was drawn to in your work, is that I think too often we see the product of things, we see the end result of things, we see the things that we can mark, and we call that history, we call that art, we call that the thing that represents, and we forget all of this is done by humans, and it affects humans, it affects lives.
The very first day that I was there with my camera was a day that we were all tear gassed, and I was standing at the very front of, just face first against the barriers. I remember running. You can hear me in a video screaming like a banshee, which is embarrassing. At the end of the day, I got home and I couldn't stop myself from immediately going to my computer and seeing, it's like I needed to live it again because it was so traumatizing, but I couldn't stop. The process became getting home every day at the end of standing out in the blazing hot heat, picking 100 images and then sorting that down to 20 and then ultimately picking 8 to put on Instagram.
Did you find surprises? Were there things that you didn't think you were going to capture and did capture?
Absolutely. And specifically on the days that we were moving really fast, running from tear gas or, force marching across the State House grounds. Those were the moments where I didn't even know what I was taking pictures of because I felt threatened. And there were a lot of moments in there where some of the expressions that were captured were really just heartbreaking and awful. But also some of the most telling, to see the fear in people's eyes as people were holding guns towards them while they had their hands up.
I think one of the things that when I look at these images, because yours takes us down from a bird's eye view down into the street view, and because you're there. You're in the street. You're right there in the front. But there's one image of an African-American woman and her facial expression. I just was so moved by and kept staring at, it's almost like you caught the exact moment where anger and sadness meet.
I know exactly what picture you're talking about. And to me, what her eyes were saying is, I'm tired. And that's actually one of the moments I was just speaking on, being on the State House grounds while everybody had their hands up and they were saying, hands up, don't shoot. A squad of scary dudes in uniforms with lots of weapons came storming the grounds for no apparent reason. And everybody just dropped to their knees. And I remember rushing to the front in that moment because I was furious. I just couldn't believe that here, while all this absolute clear nonviolence was happening, that they would dare show up and use intimidation tactics. And then they started taking medics. They started tying up the hands of medics and taking them away. And I ran up to the front, and I don't know. I don't know if I thought I could stop something from happening, but I ultimately ended up on my knees because I was terrified also. And I turned around and I saw her sitting also on her knees with her hands up. And when I looked back at that picture, I just broke down because it's heartbreaking. How many times do they have to do this same thing and then be threatened for nothing?
You know, that's exactly how I felt. How much more of this does she have to endure? And so I think when it's all said and done, you know, years from now, when we think about it in terms of what's true history, you know, personal histories, and it's these photographs are the ones that people are going to look at, and the stories that can come from that, I think, are far more important than what a politician can tell us, what a textbook can tell us.
Absolutely. I mean, I know other photographers were there, but I think one of the reasons I started staying until 11 o'clock at night, every single night for 21 days straight, was because that's when everybody else would leave. I would be the only photographer remaining, and at sunset is when people started really spilling their hearts, and those were the moments that were for me the most humbling and the ones that transformed me and my views of everything the most. It wasn't ever about, will this end up in a history book? But I did know, I was aware that if somebody wasn't there to capture those moments, something really important would be missed.
Catherine's work is part of Hindsight 2020, on view through October 24th. And hey, are you digging the music playing right now? That's her band, Rex Darling. You can check them out at Rex Darling Music on Instagram. Up next,
that would be the three kind of hallmarks of my poetry: the narrative voice, the image, and the research. I can pack a lot in very quickly, maybe sometimes too quickly.
Michele Reese, right after this.
Hey y'all, producer Drew here to fill up your social calendar for September with some exciting CMA programming. On September 8th and the 14th, take a tour and get a new perspective on Amanda McCovers' Bright Little Day Stars with volunteer coordinator and installation assistant Jackie Palmieri. On September 22nd, grab a cocktail and a seat for a panel discussion featuring Carol Suvion, executive producer and director of the Peabody Award-winning and Emmy-nominated PBS series, Craft in America. On September 25th, get your dancing shoes ready for Shea Alexander Presents Live on Boyd Plaza with popular Charlotte-based outfit Reggie Graves and Jazz Theory. You can find out more about these and all of our upcoming programs and events on our website, www.columbiamuseum.org. And now, back to the show.
So this poem is called On the Complexity of Symbols, and it has an epigraph by Ben Franklin. He is a bird of bad moral character. He does not get his living honestly. Right after my mother moved to South Carolina, a man approached her after church to show her the Confederate flag in a stained glass window. If this took place in a novel, most readers would be able to deconstruct the authorial intent implied by a white man showing a black woman his heritage. In Los Angeles, I drove an Oldsmobile. a symbol of American engineering, mass production, luxury. It was a couch on wheels, and one of the most likely vehicles to be used in the commission of a crime. I could roam the streets of South Central with impunity, but in the valley, I'd be pulled over for DWB. A protester in Air Jordans and kente cloth, with a fist raised like an Olympian and a megaphone to his lips, knelt before empty State House stairs and a bronze statue of George Washington. He threw words at him, like Sherman's army threw bricks, missiles, breaking his cane, causing gentlemen farmers to find new ways to step on necks. In the rain and through a green-caged enclosure, I marveled at a maimed bald eagle and pondered how, before the Constitution, the presidency, the Bill of Rights, we placed it on a seal, minted it, then took it near extinction. It shrugged its 6 feet of wings and let out an impressive scat. I'm Michele Reese, and I am an English professor at USC Sumter, and a poet, a mother, and a triathlete, and a non-native South Carolinian.
You had me at triathlete. This has been a pretty wild year and a half, yeah? I mean, you know, you said being a professor at USC Sumter, a place I know a little bit about, and that in and of itself has been a tough year and a half. Being a parent has been really tough this past year and a half. Unfortunately, may still be tougher on both fronts for us. But it's also been, I think, pretty tough, right? As a poet. Did you find that you were able to write a lot over this past year? Were you, like a lot of folks, just sort of inundated by all the images and trying to process and figure out where things are? Who are we now?
Well, I am one of those poets that needs a lot of time, and I need mental energy to be able to write. So no, I was not one of those people writing furiously during the pandemic. I was one of those people not writing at all. So having this opportunity to use art to kind of get me started was very productive.
You say you weren't writing, but I would suspect you probably were still writing. I mean, it might not have been with a pen and on paper, right? But I mean, it still whirls around in your skull, right? I mean, were there moments you wanted to write, or was it literally just, no, I don't want to write?
Well, it wasn't that I didn't want to write. I do think there was a lot of the time aspect. I guess if I would just characterize the past, 18 months, it would be, I think I'm gathering a lot of materials to write. Some of the material that you gather to write is very difficult to write. I am still trying to write about Rodney King and living in Los Angeles when the first verdict came out. I've never been able to write that poem. So sometimes there are things happening in your world that, I don't know, maybe take 50 years to process. And some of the things that I think happened to most of us during this past year might fall in those categories.
That's a very good point. I mean, I think, it's not always natural for us as poets to write immediately about something. I mean, we do need to have time to process. We need to give ourselves time, distance, so that we can organize our own feelings and our own thoughts about it before we can really write about it. Rodney King, when that verdict came in, because I remember, I was still in high school when that had happened. I remember seeing the video footage of it and sadly thinking that, like, this was a once in a lifetime thing, because maybe now there will be an attention to it. People will start talking about it. People will realize we need to change the way we treat each other. And man, was I a stupid kid to think that that would be it. And when the verdict came out, it became clear that, I think that was probably the first time I reconciled with systemic racism and understood how that worked. To think about that then, to where we are now and all the points in between. How do we reconcile that? Do you think reading poetry and writing poetry about it is not the way, but a way?
I think it's a way. I mean, I think it's important to never stop pointing these things out, to always be a poetry of witness when you see injustices. I've always been a political poet. I always realized that all poetry is political, and that's very important. I try not to be heavy-handed with my politics. The poem that I read was probably very heavy-handed, comparatively speaking, because that was more of a sort of occasional poem, I suppose, than one that I was working in for a manuscript. I'm wanting everybody to be accepting of each other. I guess that's my political view, I guess, that everybody should get along. I think Rodney King said something like that. Can't we all just get along? And, I do this research and try to show that we should be getting along.
With this particular project, what were some things that kind of jumped out at you? Were there some challenges? Well, you talked a little bit about how sometimes you need some time, but were there some things that you felt actually kind of came out fairly easy?
Well, I was very taken. I think I have more than a couple poems in me about this image of the protester in front of the George Washington statue. And just thinking of the name George, obviously, and all the similarities between George Floyd and George Washington. And I thought that was captured in this picture. It was very complex, and there was a lot there. Coupled with the fact that I had a student that in my creative writing class many, many years ago now, named George Floyd. And so when George Floyd died, I'm having to find out if my student is alive. I mean, even just thinking about the statuary around the State House and thinking of all the staged protests there. Perhaps you've been to a few yourself, right?
Maybe.
Couple. and think of things like Nikki Finney reading on those steps. And just to see them so blank as well was kind of haunting me. And just thinking about how the police patrol in the State House at night, just like, yeah.
Yeah, well, it is interesting that for a lot of native South Carolinians, how little they know of the history of this place, right? I mean, because so much of it is told through an oral tradition, and depending on, what skin you were born into, you're going to learn a very particular kind of tradition. You never learn, for instance, if you're white and you grow up in South Carolina or in the South in general, that we lost a war, or even what the reasons were for fighting that war. I mean, it's not until you get older and you find your own enlightenment that you begin to realize, like, man, I've been lied to for a long time. Or you just see the statues, or you just, encounter the images, but there is nothing to define it. There's nothing to provide context. I think it was eye-opening for a lot of people when, for instance, more information came out about the history of the statues, of why people had been troubled for so long about particular statues, and suddenly people started to realize that. Because there was a conversation that took place, right? You find out what Sims did, and you're like, why do we have a statue of that dude? Or Ben Tillman, and at a time when we are seeing all across the South statues that are coming down, and people are like, that's our heritage. You can't do that. And they needed to be presented with the true knowledge of why that statue was constructed in the first place. It wasn't erected in 1865. It was in 1965. And there was a very particular reason for that. And when people hear that and then understand that, they might not like it. It might not make them comfortable, but at least they understand it. And I think that's been a kind of an important thing that's come out of this past year, is that, yes, there is the anger you would expect to find at a protest, and there's a reason for that. And it wasn't just in the instance of George Floyd. We have seen this over and over again. It takes people being able to talk about it. What do you want, the people who are listening to your poems or to read your poems, what do you want them to walk away feeling or thinking?
I guess I want them to question what they've been told. I think we should always be questing for more information to either back up our own opinions about things, or to kind of question them, to maybe change them.
Do you find that part of your job as a poet is to present the questions and not necessarily the answers?
Oh, certainly, because I don't have the answers.
Yeah, unfortunately, people look to us thinking that we do. I mean, I laugh if they look at me thinking that I have the answers, but, I do look at you sometimes, Michele, hoping you have the answers.
Well, I have some answers.
But I do think that's an important thing for us to remember again about poetry, is that it isn't the place necessarily to find the answers, but the place that presents the questions. And I know that makes people uncomfortable. What do you think the value is, though, for questioning everything? I mean, what's the worst that can happen and what's the best that can happen?
Well, I think the worst that could happen is inaction. You don't know the answers, so you do nothing. But I would just hope that this country would become a better place where everybody would examine their own prejudice and start living their lives without it.
How do we do that? How do we talk to each other about each other's prejudice without pushing us farther apart?
Well, we really can't have legislators hamstringing the schools. I mean, it's going to happen in schools where these hard conversations are going to have to take place. We have to train teachers to talk about these things. But these conversations can happen in the workplace as well, can happen in churches, can happen any place that people come together. But we have to be willing to have these conversations.
Michele has published poetry in a bunch of magazines, journals, and anthologies, including the poem 6 Stars Market in the Poets Respond to Race anthology published by Muddy Ford Press. I think as we start to think about how we're going to heal as a nation, and I do live with an eternal optimism that we will heal as a nation, the question always comes up to how, and for me as a poet, it makes natural sense that through poetry is one way to do that. But I think we need to understand that it isn't so much in what we hear in the poem, but what we're able to do when we write the poems. For 20 years, I've been going around the state working with young people and giving them the opportunity to write poems. And naturally, we try to write about things that, they just see on their way to school or things around the classroom, everyday objects, because that's safe. And inevitably what ends up happening, though, students will end up touching on subjects or themes that, they're dealing with for the first time. Sometimes it's death, and death of a loved one, divorce, death of a pet, things that adults even have a hard time reconciling and understanding. And so for young people, trying to understand all that for the first time is really tough. But when they write a poem about it and then they share that poem and they're able to hear from me what I feel from that poem and what I got from that poem, and it becomes the thing that they're trying to express, or I see that there are some other ways perhaps they could express it, and I give them some ideas, and I see their eyes kind of light up. It's not because I'm necessarily understanding what it is that they're going through. They expect that I understand what they're going through. I was a kid once. It's because I helped them find the language that they needed to express what they felt. We inherit our language, but it's not a given that we will grow to feel like we own our language. And a lot of times we have a hard time putting words to the way we feel. Poetry helps us to do that. Whether we're writing it and we learn it, we hear it from somebody who's leading a workshop, or we read other poets who might be writing about something that we've experienced or that we've dealt with, and we pick up some vocabulary we didn't know, or we pick up an image that we just never really thought about as a metaphor for how we feel. And then suddenly now it makes sense for what we feel. It makes sense for how we can communicate that with other people. Well, then other people hear us and now it makes sense to them. And then they're starting to share how they feel about things. That's when people realize they're not alone. They're not isolated. There's a connection, and the connection is what we need that's going to take us towards a healing process. You've been listening to Binder, a production of the Columbia Museum of Art. Today's episode was hosted by me, Ray McManus, produced and edited by Drew Barron, with special assistance from Joel Ryan Cook. Protest audio used in today's episode was provided by Aaron Smalls. We also featured a track by the band Rex Darling entitled Invisible Ink. For more information about Binder, CMA exhibitions, and programs, visit our website at www.columbiamuseum.org.